Imagine walking into a place excited about something important, only to be met with judgmental stares and whispers. That's exactly what happened to Keanu Reeves when he stepped into a high-end car dealership, dressed in his usual casual style. But little did they know, they were about to make a mistake they'd regret forever. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, let me ask you, have you ever been judged based on your appearance? Let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories that will keep you hooked till the very end. Now, back to the story. It all started on a regular afternoon when Keanu walked into a luxury showroom, eyes set on a car he had always admired. But instead of a warm welcome, he was met with skeptical looks and condescending smiles from the sales staff. And that's when things took an unexpected turn. Keanu Reeves had always been known for his humility, but that day, no one in the luxury dealership recognized him. It was a bright afternoon when Keanu stepped into the high-end showroom, dressed in a simple black jacket, faded jeans, and well-worn boots. The dealership was a place where wealthy clients were usually greeted with polished smiles and eager handshakes, but today was different. As Keanu walked toward a sleek, limited-edition sports car, his presence barely turned any heads. He ran his fingers along the smooth surface, admiring the craftsmanship. He wasn't a man who flaunted his wealth, but today, he had come to buy something special, a gift for himself, a reward for years of hard work. At the far end of the showroom, a salesman, James, stood talking to a colleague. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, he had a sharp eye for identifying serious buyers. But when he glanced at Keanu, his expression shifted from professional courtesy to silent judgment. "Looks like we have another window shopper," James muttered, shaking his head. His colleague chuckled, watching as Keanu continued admiring the car. Keanu, unaware of the assumptions being made, turned to James with a polite nod. "This is a beautiful machine. How much does it go for?" he asked, his voice calm. James sighed, already assuming this was a waste of time. "That model starts at $300,000, he said in a tone that barely hid his doubt. Keanu nodded, seemingly unbothered. "It's a great piece of engineering," he said, inspecting the interior through the tinted window. James, growing impatient, folded his arms. "Yeah, it is. But it's not the kind of car you just admire. It's the kind of car serious buyers come in for." His words were sharp, designed to make it clear. This was not a place for people who weren't prepared to spend. Keanu's eyes flickered with understanding. He had been in situations like this before, being judged, underestimated, but he simply smiled. "I'd like to take a closer look inside," he said, gesturing toward the driver's seat. James hesitated. There were actual customers, ones in designer suits and expensive watches, who deserved his attention more than this man in ordinary clothes. "I don't think that's necessary," James finally replied. "We usually don't allow test sites unless we're sure the client is ready to make a purchase." A brief silence hung between them. Keanu studied James for a moment, his face calm but unreadable. He had met people like this before, those who judged based on appearance rather than character. From across the room, another customer, a man in an expensive blazer, called out, "Hey James, can I see the new convertible?" James turned his attention immediately, flashing a bright, eager smile as he walked away, leaving Keanu standing there unacknowledged. A few other employees noticed the exchange, their eyes darting between Keanu and James. Some shook their heads, while others whispered among themselves. Keanu sighed, taking one last look at the car before turning toward the exit. It wasn't the first time he had been dismissed like this, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But just as he reached the door, a voice broke through the murmurs. "Excuse me, sir." Keanu turned. A senior manager had stepped forward, his face suddenly alert, his demeanor respectful. He looked at Keanu, then at the car James had just denied him access to. His expression shifted, a mix of recognition and urgency. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," and in that moment, everything began to change. A hushed murmur spread through the showroom. Employees exchanged glances, some confused, others sensing that something was off. The senior manager, Mr. Dawson, had a look of unease on his face. He approached Keanu quickly, his posture shifting from casual observation to urgency. "Mr. Reeves, I didn't realize you were here," Dawson stammered, his voice lower than before, almost as if he didn't want the other customers to hear. James, the salesman who had dismissed Keanu moments ago, turned back upon hearing his manager's voice. His confident smirk faded slightly as he took in Dawson's sudden change in demeanor. Keanu offered a polite smile, his tone as calm as ever. "I was just admiring the car. Seems like it's quite exclusive." James, still unaware of the situation, chuckled, regaining his arrogance. "Yeah, well, we get a lot of people coming in to look. Not many can afford it." His words were sharp, a last attempt to put Keanu in his place. A few customers had begun paying attention. One man, wearing a luxury watch, scoffed. "Seriously, what's he even doing here? Looks like he walked in by accident." Another laughed in agreement. "I bet he just wanted a picture with the car. Can't blame him, though. We all dream, right?" James smirked, encouraged by the murmurs. He folded his arms and looked at Keanu once more. "Look, sir, maybe I wasn't clear. This car is worth more than most people make in 5 years. We don't entertain casual visits, and we definitely don't waste time on people who aren't serious buyers." His voice was loud enough now that even more bystanders turned their heads. Keanu remained composed, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. The air in the room changed. Some employees shifted awkwardly, others remained still, waiting to see what would happen next. Mr. Dawson took a sharp breath. "James, stop talking." James glanced at him, confused. "I'm just making sure we're handling actual customers first, sir." Dawson's face turned pale as he turned to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, my sincerest apologies. I will personally handle your purchase." The room fell silent. James blinked. "Mr. Reeves?" The name echoed in his mind. Something about it felt familiar. And then it hit him. His throat went dry. A young employee standing nearby gasped quietly. "Wait, Keanu Reeves? The Keanu Reeves?" Another worker whispered, "The actor? The one who owns multiple businesses? The one who gave away millions to charity?" James felt a pit form in his stomach. The confident air around him evaporated. The same man he had humiliated, the one he had dismissed without a second thought, was one of the most respected names in Hollywood and beyond. The customers who had laughed earlier exchanged nervous glances. The realization spread like wildfire. Keanu, still calm, let the silence linger. He could see James's face slowly losing its color, his confidence crumbling. But he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Instead, he stepped closer to the car again, running his fingers along the polished hood. "It's a beautiful piece of engineering," he said, his tone still as composed as it had been from the start. James opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his mind racing for a way to salvage the situation. How had he not recognized him? The bystanders, who had been enjoying the humiliation earlier, now whispered among themselves. Some looked embarrassed, others curious. Finally, James found his voice, though it was much weaker than before. I didn't mean to be rude, sir. We get a lot of people who come in to waste time." Keanu tilted his head slightly, raising an eyebrow. "And you assume based on looks?" James swallowed hard. Mr. Dawson, sensing the tension, quickly interjected. "Mr. Reeves, please allow me to arrange a proper viewing for you. If you'd like, we can move to a private area, away from the crowd." Keanu considered this for a moment. Then, with a small smile, he shook his head. "No need. I'd like to complete the purchase here." James flinched at the word purchase. "He's actually buying it?" one of the customers whispered. Another shook their head in disbelief. Of course he is. He could buy 10 of these without blinking. James took a step back, sweat forming at his temple. The very man he had mocked seconds ago had just proven him wrong in the most effortless way possible, but Keanu wasn't done yet. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek black credit card. Without hesitation, he handed it to Dawson. "I'll take it now." James, frozen in place, watched as Dawson respectfully took the card and processed the transaction. The once smirking customers stood awkwardly, suddenly unsure of how to react. Then, Keanu turned back to James and met his eyes directly. His next words were calm, but they cut deep. "You never know who you're talking to." The weight of those words sank into the room. James lowered his gaze, feeling the full impact of his mistake. Keanu didn't need to say anything more. He had made his point without raising his voice, without retaliating, without humiliating anyone. And yet, the lesson had been learned. As the receipt was printed, James stood in silence, realization washing over him like a wave. And at that moment, he knew. This was a day he would never forget. The silence in the dealership was almost deafening. James, the salesman who had so confidently dismissed Keanu moments ago, stood frozen, his face drained of color. The weight of his mistake sank in deeper with every passing second. Keanu Reeves, the man he had judged, mocked, and underestimated, had just handed over his black credit card, making it clear. He wasn't just here to look. He was here to buy. Mr. Dawson, the senior manager, carefully processed the transaction, his hands moving quickly, his forehead damp with tension. The murmurs in the showroom grew louder, each whisper carrying a mix of disbelief and admiration. "I can't believe it. That's actually Keanu Reeves?" One customer muttered. "He could buy this whole place if he wanted to," another added, shaking his head. James's breathing grew uneven as he stared at the receipt printing out, a confirmation of the sale. The very man he had humiliated had just spent more money in a single moment than James had ever seen in his career. But the real impact came when Dawson turned, held out the receipt and said the words that sent chills through the room. "Mr. Reeves, your purchase is complete. The car is officially yours." James flinched. The sentence hit like a thunderclap. The customers who had mocked Keanu earlier shifted uncomfortably, realizing how wrong they had been. Employees who had remained silent now struggled to maintain eye contact. And James? He looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. "This can't be happening," he thought, his palms sweaty. He had spent the last few minutes looking down on Keanu, treating him as if he didn't belong here, only to realize he had just insulted one of the most famous and respected men in the world. Keanu remained unbothered, his calm presence standing in contrast to the chaos of realization around him. He gently took the receipt from Dawson's hand, his expression unreadable. James, his pride crushed, finally found his voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Reeves, I had no idea. I didn't mean to," he stammered, words failing him. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Didn't mean to what?" His voice was calm, yet sharp, like a quiet storm before thunder. James gulped. I didn't recognize you. I thought..." He trailed off, realizing that no explanation could justify how he had acted. Keanu sighed, slipping his wallet back into his pocket. "And if I wasn't me?" he asked, his voice laced with something heavier now. "Would that have made a difference?" James had no answer. The realization hit the entire room like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about money, it was about character. Keanu had walked in like any other person, with no bodyguards, no flashy suit, no signs of extreme wealth. And just because of that, James had assumed he wasn't worth his time. And now, that assumption had turned into his biggest mistake. James lowered his head, his earlier arrogance shattered into dust. The people who had once laughed at Keanu now looked at him with awe. The ones who had ignored him now wished they had treated him differently. Keanu, still composed, let the silence linger. The lesson had been taught without a single outburst, without revenge, without malice. Finally, with a small, knowing smile, he turned back to Dawson. "Can you have it delivered?" "Of course, Mr. Reeves. Right away." And just like that, Keanu walked out, leaving behind a room full of people who would never judge someone by their appearance again. James stood there, his world spinning. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like never before. The same man he had dismissed with a condescending smirk had just proven him wrong, not by shouting, not by retaliating, but simply by being himself. Keanu Reeves had every reason to be angry, to humiliate James the way he had been humiliated. But he didn't. Instead, he remained composed, unshaken. James finally managed to take a step forward. His voice was low, uncertain. "Mr. Reeves, I truly apologize. I misjudged you. I was wrong." Keanu studied him for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a small sigh, he spoke. "You didn't misjudge me. You misjudged yourself." James looked up, confusion flickering in his eyes. Keanu continued, his voice calm but firm. "You thought you could tell someone's worth by their clothes. You thought respect had to be earned by wealth. But respect isn't about money, it's about character." James lowered his gaze. He had spent years in this business, working with people who flaunted their riches, who demanded attention the moment they walked in. He had believed that money equaled importance, that only those who looked successful deserved his time. And now? That belief had shattered into pieces. Mr. Dawson, the manager, watched the exchange quietly. He had worked with Keanu before. He knew the kind of person he was. He wasn't surprised that Keanu had handled the situation with such grace. James swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I swear, I'll never make this mistake again." Keanu's lips curled into the faintest smile. "That's a good start." The words weren't exactly forgiveness, but they weren't rejection either. They were a challenge, a reminder that change is proven through action, not empty words. The other employees, who had watched everything unfold, felt a shift in the air. Some of them had judged too. Some had laughed. And now they all felt the weight of it. James turned back toward the showroom, his eyes falling on the same car Keanu had bought. Just an hour ago, he had been so sure of himself, so certain that he knew who deserved to be here and who didn't. Now, he wasn't sure of anything. Keanu turned toward the exit, but before he left, he paused. "One more thing, James." James stiffened. "Yes?" Keanu's voice was softer now, almost thoughtful. "People remember how you treat them, not just customers, but everyone." James nodded slowly, taking in the words. A lesson he wouldn't forget. Keanu gave him one last look, then stepped out, disappearing into the streets. And as James stood there, still holding onto the receipt of the most expensive sale of his career, he realized something. He had gained something far more valuable than money that day. James stood frozen as Keanu walked out of the dealership, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. Shame, regret, and realization swirled within him like a storm. He had spent years believing he understood people, that his instincts about customers were always right. But today, he had been completely, utterly wrong. As he turned back toward the showroom, lost in thought, a small voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir." James looked down to see a young boy standing beside him, no older than 10 or 11 years old. The boy clutched a small notebook in his hands, his eyes wide with excitement. "Was that really Keanu Reeves?" the boy asked, his voice filled with wonder. James blinked, still caught off guard. Yeah, that was him." The boy's face lit up. "He's my mom's favorite actor. She always says he's one of the kindest people in the world." James felt a pang in his chest. Kind. That wasn't a word anyone would have used to describe him today. The boy hesitated, then looked down at his notebook. "Do you think If I wait outside, he might sign this for me. James sighed, glancing toward the glass doors. Keanu was already stepping onto the sidewalk, ready to leave. He probably didn't want to be stopped again. But then, something shifted inside James. He looked at the boy, at the sheer hope on his face, the kind of hope he had just tried to crush in someone else. For the first time that day, James did something unexpected. He knelt down to the boy's level, offering a small smile. "Tell you what," he said, his voice softer than before. "I'll go ask him for you." The boy's eyes widened. "Really?" James nodded, then, before he could second-guess himself, hurried toward the door. Outside, Keanu was about to step into his car when he heard a voice behind him. "Mr. Reeves!" Keanu turned. To his surprise, it wasn't a fan or a reporter. It was James. For a second, Keanu said nothing. But then, he noticed something different about James's expression. James swallowed hard, then gestured back toward the dealership. "There's a kid inside. He's got a notebook. He's hoping for your autograph." Keanu glanced toward the window and spotted the small face pressed up against the glass. And then, in true Keanu fashion, he smiled. "Of course." He walked back into the showroom, where the boy practically bounced with excitement. Keanu crouched beside him, took the notebook and signed it with care. "Always be kind, Keanu Reeves." The boy's mother, who had been standing nearby, wiped away a tear. "Thank you," she whispered. James watched the moment unfold, feeling something shift inside him. He had spent the day chasing sales, chasing wealth, chasing the wrong things. But in that moment, he realized that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could mean more than money ever could. As Keanu stepped out of the dealership, the boy clutching his signed notebook like a treasured prize, James stood watching, his mind heavy with reflection. For years, he had measured people by their appearance, by their clothes, their status, their ability to flaunt wealth. But today, he had learned the hardest lesson of all. Keanu Reeves had walked into the showroom without any display of riches, no flashy jewelry, no entourage, just a man admiring a car. And yet, he had carried more value in his humility than any billionaire ever could. James let out a slow breath, feeling a weight settle on his chest. What had he been chasing all these years? The truth was painful, but it was clear. Respect isn't something you give only to those you think deserve it. It's something you give to everyone. Inside the showroom, employees whispered amongst themselves, their own perceptions shifting. The customers who had laughed earlier now stood awkwardly, replaying their own behavior in their minds. But the one person who had changed the most was James. As he turned back to his desk, Keanu's final words echoed in his mind. "People remember how you treat them." And James knew this was a lesson he would never forget. Because in the end, the real value of a person isn't in their bank account. It's in their kindness,